Our final panelist is Carmaletta Williams. It gives me special pleasure to introduce her as the next speaker on our Public Scholarship in the Humanities program this evening here at Governor State University. Carmaletta Williams and I have known each other for a dozen years, going back to when we were sister co-chairs on the Modern Language Association's Committee on the Status of Women in the Profession. Dr. Williams is Executive Director of the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City, Missouri. Before taking on that role, she taught courses in English and African American Studies at Johnson County Community College in Kansas for over 28 years, where she was also the inaugural director of JCCC's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. After retirement from JCCC, she spent a year in China teaching at Central China Normal University. Her research focuses on racial identity formation, and her wide-ranging publications include Family History, Writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Letters of Langston Hughes, and Literature for Children. She won an Emmy for her portrayal of Harlem Renaissance novelist, anthropologist, and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston on R. Crosby Kemper III's Meet the Past program on Kansas City Public TV in 2015. The arc of Dr. Williams' career in Kansas, brought to life in her chapter for Public Scholarship and Literary Studies, reveals how her academic career, her public engagement, and her own scholarship are inextricably linked. In Takin It to the Streets, Public Scholarship in the Heartland, Williams forthrightly shows the challenges, risks, and rewards of her engagement with the public, and in so doing, offers inspiration to others to take courage and go forth. We are delighted that she is here to share some of that with us this evening. Karma.
Thank you, Rosemary. I appreciate this. This was wonderful. When I met Rosemary at MLA, she was so smart and on point and kind. And so I knew she was going to be a dear friend. It's like, okay, I like her. We're going to be okay. And she had this insight into women in the profession, which was our committee, that just kind of spilled over into all the rest of our academic lives. And at the college, at the community college where I taught, it was interesting in that it was a PWI. And I said that one time at a meeting, and one of my board members just went off. He just blasted me about the way I referred to the college. And I was dumbfounded. I said, "Are you talking about me calling this a PWI?" And he said, "Yes, how dare you?" I'm like, that means predominantly white institution. Look around you. That shouldn't be a secret. Look at the board. You don't see any people there. We have 3% of our student population, people of color. And then I knew from his reaction, and he was like, "Oh," but from his reaction and that from others in my classrooms, I knew that my job was bigger than standing there and talking about the literature of Maya Angelou. I had to take it to the streets. I had to let the people in my constituency understand that they really had to buy in to what was going on at our college and what our students were experiencing. And they had to help me to make that a welcoming place for our student body. Students weren't coming to our college. They were going to Kansas City, Kansas Community College in the adjacent county because it had a more diverse student body and faculty. These people weren't showing up at my institution because it was the #1, according to one of our presidents. It was the Harvard of the Midwest. I'm like, oh, please. But they weren't coming there because we were the Harvard of the Midwest. They were coming there because there was something that was important for them, and that was rooted in their racism, in their racial identity. And they could find other people who looked like them and thought like them and acted like them, and then they could ignore all the rest of us. So I knew that before I left there, then my job had to be to change some of that, to illuminate some of that. And I had a wonderful, brilliant little girl, she's a traditional student in my class, who was giving me a wonderful compliment about I was the first color teacher she had had and how wonderful an experience she was having. And another student in class said, "What? We don't call them colored anymore." And I'm like, okay, where do I start? But a book was the place to start. And the Kansas Humanities Council had set up a program called Talk About Literature in Kansas. And the communities could choose which books they wanted to talk about in their book clubs and who they wanted to lead the discussion. I was surprised to see how many people wanted me to come, because I was surprised that they chose books about African-American people. There are two centers, population centers in Kansas. One is on the eastern part, which is right across the state line, one block, one street from Kansas City. And then the southern part of that area is where the college was, the PWI. And then the northern part of that area was where the KCK, Community College, was. And I lived in Missouri across the state line. The other population center was in South Central Kansas, and that was Wichita. And it's not a big place, but it had more diversity than we had at our college, and certainly throughout the whole state. So I got in my car and I did the Zora Neale Hurston thing, and I packed some bags and a little suitcase, and I traveled. I was really interested in seeing what response that people were going to have. Would they have read the book? Would they know anything about the writers? I knew it wasn't going to be academic discussions. We had advanced literature classes, and I would have those discussions with those students. So I knew that wasn't going to happen in the community. But they did want to talk, and they wanted to talk about and tell me their story. So those books were actually just a segue into them talking about their lives and their identity. And racial identity is one of my interests. So I got interested in saying, how do they identify themselves, and where do they see it coming out of this text? Well, it could be one I remember was just as simple as a woman who said, "Oh yeah, I used to work in a cafe. And I remember when they bought the prisoners of war across the state of Kansas, and the prisoners and the white military men could sit in the cafe and eat. The Black soldiers would have to go around to the back and eat." She said, "I couldn't do anything about that, but I could make sure that they were treated well." So I knew then that there was something in these folks who were coming to hear me speak that wanted to acknowledge racial differences, wanted to somehow bridge those gaps, and wanted to make sure that their communities knew that this was available to them. And I got invited back several times because they would have different questions and different things that they wanted to talk about the next time. So it became really, really interesting. And when I would talk to them, I would try not to impose myself on them, because I'd had an experience in a classroom where a student said, "I just can't take it anymore." And I'm like, "What is wrong with you?" She said, "I just can't take it. You take this too personally." I'm like, "Excuse me?" She said, "You just take it too personally." And then it clicked. I'm like, "Oh, okay." So when I'm talking about racial situations, and I'm talking about slavery, and I'm talking about bringing Black bodies from Africa to this country, and the enslavement of those descendants and those people and Black folks now, I say we. "Yes, it's so personal. It's all about you." I'm like, "I forgot to tell you when you came into this class, because I thought you could see that I'm Black. So it is personal for me. It is my history. And I expect everyone in this class to acknowledge their histories. You may not know where your folks are from. You may not know what their histories are about, but those are your stories. Nobody else can tell your story. Nobody else can write your story. Nobody else can interpret your story. So you have to know that. And if you need some help, that's why we're here. That's why there are colleges and universities and schools and libraries and churches and community centers, because people will help you find that and acknowledge that, but you can't just say it. And please, whatever you do, don't ever say you're colorblind. What? But I don't see race. Sure you do. Sure you do. We all see race. And if you don't see race, the first race to disappear is Black. And I don't want you to make me disappear. When you see me, I want you to see a pretty smart Black girl. That's what my mother used to say. That's what I want you to see. And I want you to acknowledge that, but also acknowledge what that gives me, that I bring special to the table. When I got my job, actually, I first got hired on to teach people with learning challenges and disabilities. But then they realized that I knew Black history, Black literature. I was a literary historian. So they had other plans for me. And I took that route because that was great. And it gets frustrating teaching people with head injuries. But in that class, then I realized that sometimes students just want to be voyeurs. They just want to sit there and let you tell them what it's about. And that's not what teaching is for me. I had to bring them in. They had to acknowledge it, and they had to do some research. So when you read, when I tell you that Maya Angelou is going to be our featured speaker here at the college, and one of my students, well, actually, she was my sign language interpreter, ran up to her after a beautiful performance and said, Maya, will you sign my book? And Miss Angelou turned around and said, you may call me Dr. Angelou. You may call me Professor Angelou. You may even call me Miss Angelou, but you may not call me Maya. So she was upset, right? And the student was all in tears. Oh my God, I was just trying to be nice. Like, you read the book. You read I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Why does she have that attitude? And is she the only one? Where did that come from? Did you not remember the scene where the little white girl with the dirty panties was doing flips in front of her, calling her grandmother by her first name? But her grandmother had to respond to her by her last name. So then literature then becomes that tool when we take it to the streets that people can use to understand why there are these rifts and racial attitudes, why people fight, why they don't understand. And it's right there. It's in black and white. Let's read it. Since I've taken this job, when I was in China, it was interesting because whatever I told them, they were okay with it. And there wasn't a whole lot for me to talk about Chinese and African-American relations, except, likes to use, travel to China and Japan, and what were those trips like? But here, now that I'm at the Black Archives, it's completely different because my audience is different. I'm not at a PWI anymore. People take Black in Black Archives seriously. And I got a, Dr. Carmen, this is a 911 call. And when I came back from China, I started a publishing house. And usually when I got those calls, somebody had lost a family member. They wanted me to help them write an obituary, do a funeral program. So my response was, oh, I'm so sorry, who passed? And they said, nobody died. Well, if nobody died, why is this a 911 call? I said, because the Black Archives is in chaos and we need you to come run it. They're like, nope, I'm not going to do that. I like working at home in my pajamas and I'm going to keep doing that. I'm like, but we need you. Your name is the only one that came up. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm not that egotistical to think that there's 500,000 people in Kansas City and millions of people in this country, and my name was the only one that came up, but it's in chaos. I said, oh, okay, I got that. When it came up, who would be foolish enough to take on this adventure? My name probably popped up a couple of times, but I went there, said, come down and talk to us. So I agreed. And I fell in love with that place because it was filled with artifacts about African-American life and culture. Every one of those pieces, I came to learn, had been donated to the archives. They didn't pay for anything, which told me that people are really interested in learning those stories and preserving those stories of who they are and how they got to where they are and how they come to their racial identification. So I agreed to it. And then once we opened the doors and said, okay, this is what we're doing, more and more people came in. I had a friend of mine who was actually moving to Texas to help her daughter who had just had twins from your record collection. As 78s and 33s, I'm like, the Jazz Museum is right across the parking lot. Why don't you take that to them? And she said, because I know you'll take care of it and I know you'll tell the story. And that was the bottom line. We've had thousands of pictures of Black firefighters, Black police officers, Black politicians. So we have what we call picture parties and we invite them in. None of these pictures have names on them. It's like, okay, tell us who these folks are so that we can put them in our database and other researchers can use them. Those end up being big reunions. Oh yeah, remember when we took this picture and this happened? I'm like, yeah. Now move on to the next picture. But it's the story, that inherent knowledge of how did we get to be here? What made this place? Everybody knows about, we're on 18th and Vine. Everybody knows about, Kansas City and going to Kansas City, 18th and Vine. Well, we're at 17th Terrace. We're half a block back. And so our role then is, I tell people we're the linchpin for the area because we teach people. We have had classes on everything that you can imagine. And I let them tell me what they want to talk about. They choose the books, they choose the topics. And then we have a large lecture hall, we call it, and it's supposed to hold 220. I don't let 220 people come in there for the talks because we'd never get out, because everybody wants to contribute. They all have a story and they want to make sure that somebody knows what their story is. So that's taking it to the streets. It's 18th and Vine Street, but it's also bringing in that history. And they bring with them pictures and documents and programs, all kinds of artifacts that help to prove that they're telling us the truth, that what they're saying is real. And we've had researchers from literally all around the world, from Sweden and South Africa and China, all across the United States. A woman wrote an article about her research at the archives, and she lived in London. And so we were really proud to parade that around. But we have to get it outside of the building, outside of that classroom. And so that's what we're doing now. We're taking it to the people and the community. They're excited about that. They're so eager to have somebody tell their stories. And when I tell them that you can't depend on other people to tell your story, you have to tell your own. And they say, oh, we can't write that. I don't know how to do that. Okay, let's have a class on doing it. No, I can't do that. I'll just tell you and you write it down. It's like, I am not your amanuensis. I'm not going to write down your story, but you can record it. And so we've done a lot of oral histories. And it's amazing what people reveal as they're telling their stories, because they want people to know where they came from, what their lives were like, and how their folks suffered and sacrificed and made great strides to make things happen for them. So what started out as a cute little comment that hacked me off at school ended up being sort of a mission in life, in that people want to talk about it. They want people who are learn it to hear them, and they want your validation. I sometimes just go Dr. Karma, because they love to hear doctor. They don't want to just hear Karma. They love to hear Dr. Karma, and they call me Dr. Karma. Sometimes they even call me just doctor, because they want somebody to validate their stories. And that's what you get when you have this community educational component in whatever work you're doing. If it's students in your classroom, if you're going to community libraries, community centers, come to Black archives or some other place like that, people want their lives validated. And that's what community teaching is about, what community learning is about, is to make sure that those experiences are somehow validated. And I enjoy doing that. I love hearing those stories. I love telling the stories, and I love writing down the stories too. So this is good. And when I got this invitation, I was really excited. Thank you, Rosemary.